There is a phrase the
By the
wardens
authority
still
of the first
refuse to
accord,
translate.
we invoke the
Not
forgotten
because
law.
it cannot be translated. Every language in the Concordat's 11,000 cataloged tongues has words for refusal, for defiance, for the small human act of standing still when the universe expects you to run. The wardens refuse to translate it because translating it would mean admitting what it did to them. Historians on 100 worlds still argue about the exact moment it happened. Some say it was the silence in the amphitheater that lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Others say it was earlier in a cargo hold 3 light years away when a woman decided not to shoot. The choir themselves, the only witnesses who experienced every version of events simultaneously, have never said. They only sing about it, in a register too low for most species to hear, on the anniversary of a day that has no name on any calendar but one. This is not that song. This is what happened before it was worth singing about. 6 months before any of that mattered, the Concordat cruiser Verdant Accord dropped out of transit above a planet its charts listed only as Designate 7, a blue-green world orbiting a yellow star in a spiral arm the Concordat had not bothered to survey in 11,000 years. There was no reason to. The arm was quiet. Quiet world stayed quiet. Commander Sela Ithorn of the Vastor Compact stood on the observation deck and watched the planet turn beneath her, unhurried, indifferent to the fact that it was about to become important. Radio noise across 40 bands, said the ship's cognition lattice, a Dralim crystalline intelligence named Ossuary who had chosen the name for reasons it declined to explain. Structured, deliberate, they know we're here. They can't know we're here, Sela said. We're not transmitting. They know something is here. There's a difference, and it's the difference that concerns me. Sela did not ask what ossuary meant. She had learned in 900 years of service that Dralim crystals rarely explained themselves before they were ready, and pressing them only slowed the explanation down. Instead, she watched the noise pattern scroll across the display. Overlapping signals, some encrypted, some not, a species arguing with itself in real time across 40 different frequencies about 40 different things, all at once, without any apparent central authority coordinating the argument. That's not a civilization, she said. That's a fight that never ends. Perhaps, said Ossuary. Or perhaps that is what a civilization looks like when nobody has told it yet that it needs permission to exist this way. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, because the thought was not yet worth saying aloud. That something about the noise felt less like the early transmissions of a young species, and more like the background hum of something that had already decided, a long time ago, that it did not intend to ask anyone for permission to be anything. The Concordat had a name for this moment and a procedure to match: first threshold contact. Ossuary opened the appropriate archive without being asked, because some archives were opened as a matter of ritual rather than necessity, and this was one of them. Every species that reaches the threshold of interstellar awareness is offered the accord, the archive read, in the old formal Vastor dialect reserved for law. The accord does not compel. The accord invites. What a species does with the invitation determines what it becomes within the Concordat's care. Sela had recited those words during her own species' threshold, 400 years before she was born, in a ceremony she had only ever seen recorded. She knew what came next as well as she knew her own name. First contact, observation, the offering. Then, if the species accepted, and every species eventually accepted because the alternative was extinction by attrition, quietly enforced the trials. The trials were the part nobody talked about afterward. Every species that passed through them emerged the same way: humbled, grateful, integrated, useful. Every species that passed through them also emerged, without exception, permanently and comprehensively organized beneath the Concordat's oldest members. Nobody called this a hierarchy. The word the Concordat preferred was stewardship. Sela had never once, in 900 years, questioned whether stewardship was the right word for it. She was about to start. They made contact on the fourth day, not because the humans found them, but because the humans, having noticed an anomaly in their outer solar system consistent with nothing they'd ever launched, sent something up to look at it. It was small. It was not weaponized in any way the Concordat's sensors recognized. It carried, painted on its hull in 6 different human languages and one that turned out to be mathematics, the words, "We see you, we are not afraid, we would like to talk." Ossuary played the TH. E-message for Sella 3 times before either of them spoke. "They found us in 4 days, Sella said finally. It took the Vashter analog 11 years to detect the Concordat's arrival ships during our own threshold. Perhaps they are simply attentive, Ossuary said, but its voice carried a note Sella had rarely heard from a crystalline intelligence, something adjacent in a machine sense to unease. Or perhaps, Sella said, they were already looking. The historian's voice returns here briefly, the way it will return throughout, because there are things that only make sense once you know how the story ends, and the historian has the unfair advantage of already knowing. What she will tell you when she finally speaks in full is this: humanity had been listening to the stars since before it had the technology to leave its own atmosphere, for reasons that had nothing to do with the Concordat and everything to do with the fact that humans, alone among the Concordat's 11,000 catalog species, had never fully trusted silence. They found silence suspicious. They found it on some animal level none of their philosophers ever fully articulated rude. This will matter more than anyone in the Concordat expected it to. For now, though, we return to the beginning of the story, where nobody yet understands what they are dealing with, least of all the humans themselves. The first delegation to make planetfall consisted of 4 beings: Sella, ossuary in its mobile chassis, a Thren diplomat named Corvain whose entire species communicated through calibrated silences and precisely timed breathing, and a young Vashter attaché named Idrin Kess who had never left the Compact's home cluster before, and who spent the descent quietly rehearsing greetings in 17 languages he did not expect to need. They landed in a field outside a city the humans called, with what Idrin considered a startling lack of ceremony, Geneva. The delegation that met them numbered exactly 4 as well, which Sella noted with interest, an unspoken symmetry or a coincidence or possibly a message, though what kind of message a number could constitute remained unclear. There was a woman with gray at her temples who introduced herself as Dr. Amara Akonquores, a linguist. There was a man in a plain gray uniform without insignia who gave only the name Havorson and did not specify what he was a colonel of or in what. There was a young man who never spoke and appeared to be recording everything, and there was, standing slightly apart from the others in a way that suggested rank rather than distance, a woman who introduced herself simply as Voss. "Commander Alina Voss," she said when Sella asked. "Though I'd rather you didn't lead with that, we're not here to talk about armies." "Then what are you here to talk about?" Sella asked. Voss looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Idrin later described it in his report as evaluative in a way I did not expect from a species 4 days into contact, and said, "We'd like to know what you want, before we decide what we're willing to give." It was not the response the Concordat's protocols anticipated. The protocols anticipated wonder or fear or eager compliance, or some negotiable blend of the 3. They did not anticipate a species 4 days past its own first alien sighting asking calmly what the visitors intended to take. Sella filed the moment away without understanding, yet, how much it would come to matter. The offering took place 3 weeks later, in a chamber built specifically for it aboard a Concordat relay station humanity had been permitted under close supervision to help construct. It was meant to be humanity's introduction to the wider galaxy. Star charts, the philosophical foundations of Concordat law, a summary, carefully worded of what stewardship entailed. Dr. Akonquores sat through all 4 hours of it without interrupting once. When it ended, she asked a single question. "What happens to species that decline?" The Concordat envoy, an ancient Thren jurist named Alvi Dorsch who had presided over 11 thresholds and had never once been asked this in the opening session, allowed a pause of exactly the length that, in Thren custom, indicated genuine surprise. No species has declined, Alvi said, not in recorded memory. That's not an answer, Alconquerez said. That's a statistic. I asked what happens. The offer of stewardship remains open, Alvi said carefully. Indefinitely, a species that declines simply continues as it was, alone. Is alone but not attacked. The Concordat does not make war on those who decline its help. Does the Concordat make anything else on them? Alvi did not answer immediately, and in that silence, Sella, watching from the observation gallery, uninvited into the actual negotiation but permitted, as junior officers often were, to witness, understood for the first time that the humans had found on Thay. Our first real day of contact, the exact seam in the Concordat's law that 11,000 years of grateful, integrated species had never thought or dared to pull at. They accepted the offering anyway, not out of fear, and not out of the eager gratitude the Concordat's records showed from every prior species. Halvorsen put it plainly, in the closing session, in the flat tone of a man reciting a decision that had already been made by people above his pay grade and that he personally found reasonable. "We'll go through the trials," he said. "We're not naive enough to think we can refuse forever, and we're curious enough that we don't especially want to. But we want it on record publicly in the Concordat's own archive that we asked what happens to species who decline and that the answer we received was evasive. If anything happens to us later that this room finds surprising, that evasion will be the reason why." Alvi Dorsch, in 900 years of diplomatic service, had never had a species enter its trials with a formally lodged grievance already on the record. It would not be the last thing about humanity's threshold that had never happened before. The trials themselves were older than any species now living to take them, older even than the choir who administered them, though the choir were old enough that this fact alone should have given every prior participant pause. Nobody knew who had first designed the trials. The Concordat's founding myths were vague on the point in a way that felt, to anyone who examined it too closely, less like forgotten history and more like a silence maintained on purpose. There were 5 trials, and they were the same for every species, adjusted only for physiology. The trial of endurance, the trial of judgment, the trial of sacrifice, the trial of unity. And last, the trial that had no name in any language, translated by convention simply as the reckoning in which the species being tested was made to face in some symbolic and sometimes literal form the worst thing it had ever done to itself. No species had ever failed all 5. Every species that reached the reckoning passed it because, as the Concordat's own archives quietly acknowledged in language dense enough that almost nobody bothered to parse it, the reckoning was designed to be passable by any species humble enough to have survived the first 4. Humility, it turned out, was the actual criterion, not strength, not wisdom. Willingness to be reshaped by what you had learned about your own worst impulses, and to let that reshaping be supervised. Sella had once found this beautiful. She had described it as a cadet, as the wisest thing her species had ever agreed to. She no longer used that word, though she could not yet have said why. Humanity's trial of endurance took place on a moon the Concordat had prepared decades in advance for exactly this purpose. Brutal gravity, an atmosphere thin enough to punish every wasted breath, a landscape of black glass ridges that had killed, over the millennia, at least one member of nearly every species that had attempted to cross them. The human team consisted of 6 people. Elena Voss was among them, which surprised the Concordat's overseers. Commanders of her presumed rank rarely volunteered for the physical trials in other species' experience, and which did not surprise Sella at all by now. They did not cross the ridges quickly. They crossed them methodically, roping themselves together in configurations the Concordat's mountaineering archive did not recognize, resting when the archive's models said they should be pushing forward when the models said they should rest. Two of them nearly died on the third day when a glass shelf gave way beneath a woman named Priyanka Rao. She did not fall alone. The man beside her, a quiet engineer named Tomas Adami who had said perhaps 40 words in the entire expedition, went down with her rather than let the rope cut her in half against the ridge. They both survived. The Concordat's observers noted, with the clinical interest of a species watching an anomaly, that Adami's choice had cost the team 11 hours of schedule and had not been, by any metric the trial measured, necessary. The models had accounted for the possibility of Rao's fall. They had not accounted for anyone choosing to fall with her. Inefficient, noted a Vashter observer reviewing the footage. Yes, Sella said, and found, to her own surprise, that she did not say it as a criticism. They passed the trial of judgment in a way that unsettled the choir more than the Concordat later admitted publicly. The trial of judgment presented each species with a moral puzzle calibrated to their particular blind spots the choir determined through months of quiet observation before the trial began. For most species, the puzzle involved some variation on the same theme, a choice between saving many strangers or fewer of one's own. Engineered so that the correct answer, the one the Concordat wished to see, was the utilitarian one. Species that chose their own too readily were marked as insufficiently evolved past tribalism. Species that chose strangers too readily without hesitation were marked as insufficiently bonded to be trusted with autonomy. The correct answer sat in a narrow, specific middle: hesitation, difficulty, and ultimately the mathematically larger number. Humanity's puzzle was delivered to Dr. Okonkwo's alone, in a chamber with no cameras the humans were aware of, though of course there were cameras. She was shown, via a projection she was assured was not real but was told to treat as if it were, a scenario. A Concordat transport in distress, carrying 300 Vashter colonists and a single human deep space vessel with the capacity to intercept and save perhaps a third of them before the transport's containment failed entirely. She was given 90 seconds to issue an order. She did not issue one. Instead, at second 11, she said aloud to whatever was listening, "This isn't a rescue problem. This is a resource allocation problem you've dressed up as a rescue to see if I'll accept your framing. I want to talk to the actual transport captain, if there is one, about why they only have 30 minutes of containment left and not 60, because that number is the actual crisis and nobody's asked about it." There was no transport captain. There had never been a real crisis. The trial's architecture assumed universally across 11,000 prior tests that a sufficiently pressured mind under a ticking clock would engage with the moral content of the scenario as presented and would not step outside the frame to interrogate the frame itself. The chamber went dark for 4 minutes while the choir, in whatever manner the choir conferred with themselves, decided what to do with a participant who had, in effect, declined to play. When the lights returned, Okonkwo was told, through a translated voice she could not place a species to, that she had passed. She did not ask why. She had already guessed correctly that the trial had never actually been able to fail someone who refused its terms outright because no rule existed for it. Nobody had ever tried. She simply hadn't been sure the guess would hold and had been prepared, she told Voss afterward, to be wrong. It was after the trial of judgment that the mid-story truth first cracked open, though nobody outside a small circle understood its size yet. Idrin Kess, still the junior-most member of the Vashter delegation, had been assigned, as a make-work courtesy, the kind given to attachés not trusted with anything that mattered, to catalog archival references to the trial's original design, a task every prior generation of attaché had performed and abandoned within a week, because the material was dense, ancient, and apparently exhaustively studied already. Idrin did not abandon it within a week. He was, by his own later admission, bored, and boredom made him thorough in a way ambition never had. 3 weeks into humanity's trials, buried in a cross-referenced footnote to a footnote in a legal commentary 9,000 years old, written in a dialect of Proto-Thren that only 40 living scholars could still read fluently, Idrin found a clause. The trials exist to determine fitness for stewardship, and stewardship alone, the clause read, in the flat, unemotional voice of ancient law. No species may be compelled to seek any status beyond what it requests. A species that formally petitions the convening choir, not the Concordat administration, but the choir directly, for recognition of sovereign standing prior to the completion of the fifth trial forfeits the protections of stewardship but may not be denied the petition itself, so long as it is made in the old tongue before witnesses and accepted at personal cost by the one who speaks it. Idrin read it 4 times before he understood what it meant, and then sat very still for a long time because what it meant was this. Buried in law 9,000 years old, in a clause no species had ever invoked because no species had ever known to look for it, was a door. Not an escape from the trials, the humans, or anyone else could not simply refuse to be tested, but a way to change what passing the trials would actually mean. A way to walk in seeking stewardship and walk out, instead, having asked for something the Concordat had never once in 11,000 years been asked to actually give. Recognition as an equal rather than a ward. The cost was the part that stopped him cold. Accepted at personal cost by the one who speaks it. The old commentaries did not specify what the cost was. They only noted, in the dry manner of ancient scribes documenting a rule nobody expected to matter, that in every hypothetical the framers had considered, the cost had been assumed to be steep enough that no sane petition would attempt it lightly. Idrin did not know what to do with what he had found. He was 26 years old, 4 months into his first posting, and he was holding, in a translated footnote, something that could either reshape the galaxy's oldest institution or get an entire species he had grown, against his will, to respect killed. He took it to Sella. Sella took 3 days to decide whether to believe him, and 2 more to decide whether believing him obligated her to do anything. If I show this to the humans, she said, on the 5th day, standing with ossuary on the observation deck of the Verdant Accord while Designate 7 turned beneath them. And it's real, I'm handing them a weapon against the oldest law we have. If I don't show it to them and they find it themselves, and Idrin found it in 3 weeks with no direction, so someone like Concordat will find it eventually, then I've spent this entire threshold helping enforce a system I could have told them how to question and didn't. Those aren't the only 2 options, Ossuary said. What's the third? You could ask yourself why, in 900 years of service, you never once looked for that clause yourself. Sella did not have an answer for that. She had never looked because it had never occurred to her to look, because she had been raised, trained, and promoted within a system that treated the trial's purpose as settled long before she was old enough to question settled things. It had taken a species 4 days old to contact, 4 weeks into its own threshold, to ask a question that had simply never come up in 9 centuries of her own life. That, she understood finally, was the actual design of the system. Not cruelty, not malice. Just an old, comfortable, self-perpetuating assumption passed down by species who had themselves never questioned it, each generation a little further from the moment when questioning it would have been possible at all. She gave Idrin's translation to Elena Voss the following morning, in the plain, unceremonious way Voss herself had first introduced herself, weeks before. I don't know what this costs you, Sella said. Nobody does. Nobody's used it in 9,000 years. I'm giving it to you because I think somebody should have given it to somebody a long time ago and nobody did. Voss read it twice, in the flat clinical translation Idrin had provided, and then looked up. Why are you telling me this, she said, instead of your own superiors? Because my own superiors already know how the story ends if nobody tells you, Sella said. They've watched it end that way 11,000 times. The trial of sacrifice came next, and here the story slows, because this is the part the historian, generations later, will linger on longest. The trial of sacrifice required of every species that reached it a single volunteer to undergo a controlled ordeal. Calibrated, the Concordat insisted, to be survivable, though survivable and unharmed were words doing very different work in that sentence. The ordeal varied by species. For most, it involved some form of prolonged physical suffering endured on behalf of others, a demonstration that the species' capacity for self-sacrifice extended beyond its instinctive defense of kin. Humanity's ordeal was assigned to Tomas Adami, the quiet engineer who had gone down the ridge with Priyanka Rao. He was not chosen by lottery as some species volunteers were, nor selected by command as others were. He volunteered, and when asked why by a Thren observer curious about the human decision process, he said only, "Someone should. It might as well be someone who's already shown he will." The ordeal itself does not need describing in full. Suffering, however calibrated, is not the part of this story that matters. What matters is what happened at its conclusion in the final minute when the Concordat system, as it did for every species, at the exact threshold of what a body could endure, offered Adami a way out. A single word in his own language that would end the ordeal immediately, with no penalty beyond the trial's automatic failure. Every species in 11,000 years had eventually said the word. Not out of weakness, the trial was designed to eventually break anyone, and breaking was not itself a failure, so long as the species had endured long enough to demonstrate sincerity. The word was expected. It was, in its own way, kind, an acknowledgement that no species should be asked to suffer past the point of meaning. Adami did not say the word. He was offered it 4 times. At intervals, the Concordat system adjusted upward each time, certain that this iteration surely would be the one where the pattern held. 4 times, through what the medical monitors described afterward in language that made 2 separate Thren observers physically leave the room, he declined it. At the edge of what his body could sustain, with the ordeal's automatic termination protocols beginning to override the trial's own parameters, because even the trial's designers had never built it to run this far, Adami said something else instead. Not the word that would end it. A different sentence, quiet, addressed to no one in the chamber, that the recording devices caught only because they caught everything. "This isn't for them," he said. "It's so the next person who volunteers doesn't have to wonder if anyone before them meant it." The ordeal ended 2 seconds later, not because he yielded, but because the automatic protocols, built by a species that had never imagined a participant refusing the exit it offered, simply ran out of calibrated ordeal to give him. The choir, whose sung communications had never once, in the Concordat's recorded memory, occurred outside their own closed chambers, sang for 11 seconds in a register audible to the observation gallery. No translation exists for what was sung. The Thren linguists who attempted one in the weeks afterward each produced a different result, and none of them agreed enough to be called official. Idrin Kess, watching from the gallery, wrote in his private log that night, "I think we just watched them realize, for the first time in recorded history, that the exit they built out of kindness had never actually been tested against a species that didn't want it." Not everyone in the Concordat wanted humanity to reach the trial of unity at all. 3 days after the trial of sacrifice, in a chamber humanity would not learn existed until long after the fact, a coalition of senior stewards convened without choir oversight, because the meeting was, by design, not the kind of meeting that required it. Its chair was a Dralim elder named Threkasses, whose crystalline lineage had overseen the integration of 400 ward species, and who had built, across 3,000 years, a reputation as the Concordat's most careful custodian of precedent. "The Adami incident," Threkasses said, opening the session without preamble, "is being discussed on 11 worlds, not as an anomaly, as an example. That is the part that concerns me. A single participant's refusal is a data point. A single participant's refusal, discussed admiringly across 11 worlds within a week, is a precedent forming in real time whether we sanction it or not. You want them slowed, said a Thren representative, not a question. I want them observed more carefully than any species we have tested in 1,000 years, Threkasi said. I am not suggesting we intervene in the trials themselves. That would violate everything the trials are meant to be. I am suggesting that we consider, quietly, whether a species this resistant to accepting the shape we offer it as a species we actually want holding equal standing in rooms like this one, should it ever occur to them to ask for it. It was, Sella learned much later, the first time in 3,000 years that Threkasi's had ever proposed watching a species trial with an eye toward what it might cost the Concordat rather than what it might mean for the species being tested. Nobody in that chamber called it fear. Everybody in that chamber understood, without needing the word said aloud, that this was exactly what it was. The coalition did not act in the end, not because they lacked the will, but because no mechanism existed to act without violating the very impartiality the trials depended on. And even Threkasi's, for all his unease, was unwilling to be the first steward in 3,000 years to break that impartiality openly. But the meeting mattered anyway because it was proof, quiet and unrecorded though it was, that humanity's small refusals, a linguist questioning a scenario, an engineer declining an exit, 40 strangers arguing their way to a working consensus, had already begun to be felt by the oldest and most careful minds in the Concordat as something closer to a threat than a curiosity. Sella did not learn of the meeting from any official channel. She learned of it from Idrin, who had learned of it from a junior Dralim clerk who had been present to record minutes, and who had found, in the weeks since discovering the old clause, that boredom had permanently stopped being a habit he could return to. They're afraid of us, Idrin said, meaning the Concordat's oldest powers, though by now he had stopped drawing a clean line between himself and the species he had spent months quietly, unofficially advocating for. Not of what we'll do to them. Of what happens to every other ward species once they watch us ask questions nobody's supposed to ask and get away with it. They're not wrong to be afraid of that, Sella said. I watched it happen to me. I stopped being able to see the trials the way I saw them a season ago, and I can't go back to seeing them that way, no matter how much simpler it would be. Do you want to go back? Sella considered this for longer than she expected to need. No, she said finally. I think I only thought I did because going back felt safer than whatever this is. But safer isn't the same as better. I don't think I understood the difference until I watched someone refuse an exit an entire species had assumed for 11,000 years that everyone would eventually take. The trial of Unity followed, and here the story's pace changes again, because Unity was the trial every species dreaded most, precisely because it required nothing external to fail. It required only that the species being tested demonstrate it could act at scale as a single coherent body under pressure, not through coercion but through voluntary alignment. Species with rigid hierarchies passed it easily, and the Concordat noted afterward always went on to make the most obedient wards. Species with fractious, argumentative cultures like the humans nearly always failed it, because the trial assumed, reasonably, that a species which spent its history disagreeing with itself would fracture the instant real pressure arrived. Humanity's trial of unity took the form of a crisis, staged with total realism, aboard the very station where the offering had first been made. A controlled failure cascading through the relay's life support, requiring 6 independent teams, scientists, engineers, the original delegation, and 40 ordinary human workers who had been present for entirely unrelated reasons and had no idea they were being tested at all, to coordinate a response with no central authority dictating orders, because the trial had been designed deliberately to remove Voss and Havorson from the command chain in its opening minute. The Concordat's models predicted chaos. 40 untested civilians, 6 specialist teams with no clear hierarchy, and a crisis engineered to reward instinctive obedience to whichever voice sounded most authoritative. A reward structure every prior tested species had gravitated toward, producing, in every case, a scramble for control that cost critical minutes before anyone else fell in line behind whoever won it. The humans did not scramble for control. They argued, loudly immediately and to the Concordat observers' visible bewilderment productively. A woman running life support triage disagreed openly with a man rerouting power, and instead of one deferring to the other's presumed authority, they spent 90 seconds arguing the actual physics of the problem in front of everyone, arrived at a synthesis neither had proposed alone, and moved on. This pattern repeated, team after team, disagreement after disagreement, each one resolved not by rank but by whoever could make the better case in the time available, and crucially, by a shared and apparently unremarkable assumption that being overruled by a better argument was not a defeat worth resenting. They have no hierarchy at all, a Vashter observer said 40 minutes into the crisis, in a tone approaching alarm. They have a hierarchy, Ossuary corrected, watching the same feed. It's just built out of arguments instead of ranks. I don't think they've noticed it's a hierarchy. I don't think they've noticed because it reforms every few minutes around whoever is right, instead of staying fixed around whoever was appointed. The crisis resolved with 4 minutes to spare, a margin the Concordat's own specialist crews had never bettered in the same scenario. The 40 civilians debriefed afterward mostly expressed confusion that anyone considered what they'd done remarkable. "We just figured out what was wrong and fixed it," one of them said when asked. "I don't know what else you expected." It is here, before the final trial, that the mid-story twist the audience has been promised finally resolves into something Sella can no longer avoid understanding. The trials were never designed to identify the strongest species, or the wisest, or even the most humble. They were designed across 11,000 years by a Concordat that had, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps not, the record does not say, built its selection process to reward exactly one trait above all others, the trait of not questioning the process itself. Every species that passed had passed by playing the game as designed, enduring what was meant to be endured, sacrificing in the shape sacrifice was meant to take, unifying under whatever structure the trial rewarded. Humanity had, without ever quite meaning to, done something different at every single stage. Not by refusing the trials, they had endured every one of them fully at real cost, but by refusing again and again to accept that the trials frame was the only frame available. A conquerors questioning the scenario instead of solving it. A Adami refusing the offered exit not out of stubbornness, but because he understood the exit itself was part of what needed to be questioned. 40 strangers building a working hierarchy nobody had told them to build, because nobody had told them not to. They had, without realizing it, been rehearsing the exact posture the ancient clause required. The willingness to stand inside a system built by someone older and more powerful, and ask, out loud before witnesses, whether its terms deserved to be accepted as given. The only trial left was the reckoning, and Alina Voss, holding Idrin's translated clause for 6 days now without telling anyone but Havorson and Aconquerres, understood exactly what she intended to do with it. She told the rest of the delegation the night before, in a mess hall aboard the relay station that had, over the preceding months, become something closer to a second home than any of them had expected a Concordat installation to feel like. Adami was there, still moving carefully, still refusing every offer of a chair with the same flat patience he refused everything unnecessary. Rao sat beside him, the way she had sat beside him on every ridge and in every debrief since the glass shelf gave way beneath her, not because either of them had ever discussed it, but because some debts settle into habit before anyone names them a debt at all. Aconquerres sat across from Voss with a data pad she wasn't reading. Havorson stood near the door, the way he always stood near doors, a habit from a career he still hadn't fully described to anyone. "If I invoke this," Voss said, laying Idrin's translation on the table between them, "I don't know what it costs. Nobody does, that's the honest truth of it, and I won't pretend otherwise to make this easier to agree to. It might cost more than any of us are prepared to pay. It might cost something none of us have thought to be afraid of yet. You're asking permission, Rao said. It wasn't quite a question either. I'm asking whether anyone in this room believes I shouldn't, Voss said, because I can carry the invocation. I can't carry the decision alone, not for all of us. The silence that followed was not the amphitheater's silence, 4 minutes of ancient law recalculating itself. It was shorter and warmer and entirely human, the particular quiet of people who have already, individually and without saying so, arrived at the same answer and are simply waiting to see who says it first. It was Adami who said it first, which did not surprise anyone at the table. I didn't stay in that chamber because I wanted to be forgiven for anything, he said. I stayed because I wanted it to mean something the next time somebody else has to decide whether to stay. If we walk out of this threshold as wards, everything we did in there gets filed away as an exception. A species that endured more than expected, humbled the way it was supposed to be humbled. If we walk out as equals, it stops being an exception. It becomes the reason somebody after us gets to ask the same question, and doesn't have to wonder if asking it is allowed. That's not nothing to risk a species on, Havorson said from the door, and it was the first time all evening he had spoken. But it's also not nothing to build a species on if we get it right. I've spent 30 years making decisions on behalf of people who never got a vote in the outcome. I'd like this, for once, to be a decision we actually make together out loud so that whatever it costs, none of us can say afterward we didn't know what we were agreeing to. They did not vote in the end, not formally. They talked until the night station cycle dimmed the mess hall's lights on its own automatic schedule, and by the time it did, nobody at that table needed a show of hands to know where they stood. A Conquerez, closing her still unread data pad, said the thing that would end up in Idrin's private log the following week, quoted more than anything else spoken that night. We came a long way to be told what we're allowed to want, she said. I'd rather go home having said at least once out loud what we actually wanted instead. Sella was not present for that conversation. She learned of it only afterward from Idrin, and she found turning it over on the observation deck of the Verdant Accord, watching Designate 7 turn beneath her one final time before the reckoning, that she envied it. Not the risk, the plainness of it. 900 years of service, and she had never once sat in a room with people she trusted and simply said out loud what she actually wanted, before being told what she was permitted to want instead. You're thinking about the meeting again, Ossuary said. It was not a question either. I'm thinking, Sella said, that I don't know what I would have said in that mess hall if it had been my species at that table instead of theirs. I don't know if we would have found the same answer. I don't know if we ever gave ourselves the chance to look for it. You still could, Ossuary said. Nothing about tonight prevents it. It only makes it harder to pretend afterward that you never had the chance. Sella did not answer, but she stayed on the observation deck long after O's. Sueri's chassis had powered down for its rest cycle, watching the blue-green world turn, thinking about 900 years of not asking, and about a species 4 days old to contact that had never quite learned how to stop. The reckoning took place in an amphitheater built for the purpose 11,000 years earlier, a vast bowl of dark stone beneath a sky the Concordat had synthesized to resemble whatever sky each tested species found most solemn. For humanity, it was night, clear and star-heavy, with no moon, because the choir's assessment of humanity's collective subconscious had determined correctly that humans found an unlit sky more honest than a comforting one. The reckoning's format was always the same. The species being tested was shown, without commentary, the worst thing it had ever done to itself, its cruelest war, its deepest betrayal, its most complete failure of compassion toward its own kind, and was required in the presence of the full convening choir and any Concordat member species who wished to witness to respond. Not to apologize, apology was assumed. Not to explain, explanation was assumed too. The species had to demonstrate, through whatever act its representatives chose, that it understood what the failure had cost, and that it intended to carry that understanding forward as a permanent weight rather than a resolved debt. Every species in recorded history had wept, prostrated, sworn oaths, or performed some ritual of grief calibrated to their own culture's mourning practices. Every species had then been welcomed formally into stewardship, humbled, forgiven, integrated. The amphitheater filled. Representatives of 40 concordat species occupied the high tiers, drawn by the unusual interest this particular threshold had generated across the wider concordat in the preceding months. Word travels, even between stars, when a species survives an ordeal nobody survives. When a young species argues with the frame of its own moral test and is not struck down for it. The choir occupied the central dais, visible only as shifting columns of soft light that sang, occasionally, in tones too low to parse. Alina Voss stood alone at the amphitheater's center. Behind her, in the gallery reserved for the tested species' full delegation, stood Conquores Havorson Adami, visibly thinner than he had been but present on his own feet, having refused a wheeled chair with the same quiet flatness he refused everything he considered unnecessary, and Priyanka Rao and the 40 ordinary workers from the relay station, and dozens more, because humanity, when asked who should witness its reckoning, had not sent a small delegation. It had sent everyone who wanted to come, and thousands had wanted to come, and the Concordat, startled by the number, had expanded the amphitheater twice. The projection began without preamble, as it always did. It showed humanity's worst war, not its bloodiest, but its cruelest, the one where the killing had been organized with the calm efficiency of people who no longer saw those they killed as people at all. It showed years compressed into minutes. The camps, the trains, the quiet paperwork of atrocity conducted in tidy offices by ordinary men who went home to dinner afterward. It showed at the end the liberation soldiers who had seen war and thought themselves prepared for it, staring instead at something that broke a preparedness no war had given them. And one of them, a young man barely out of his teens, sitting down in the mud and simply refusing for a long time to stand back up. The projection ended. The amphitheater held its held breath, 40 species worth, waiting for the ritual of grief that always followed. Alina Voss did not perform a ritual of grief. She reached into the collar of her uniform, drew out a small data cylinder Idrin Kess had given Voss 6 days earlier through Sella, and held it up, visible to the full amphitheater, to the choir, to 40 watching species who had never once seen a tested representative do anything but weep on this exact spot. "Before I answer what you've shown me," she said, and her voice, amplified by the amphitheater's old acoustics, carried without strain to every tier, "I want to invoke a clause. In the old tongue, as the law requires before witnesses at whatever cost it demands." The columns of light that were the choir went, for the first time in the recorded memory of every species present, entirely still. She spoke the clause in the old Proto-Thren Idrin had translated for her, haltingly, a human tongue never built for those sounds, and the amphitheater's ancient acoustics carried her imperfect pronunciation to every tier regardless. "I petition the convening choir," she said, "not the Concordat administration, for recognition of sovereign standing prior to the completion of the 5th trial. I understand this forfeits the protections of stewardship. I make this petition knowing the cost is not specified, and I accept it, whatever it is, on behalf of the species I represent. But I ask, before I accept it, that the cost be named aloud before these witnesses, so that no species after us is asked to accept an unknown price in silence, the way we very nearly were." For 4 minutes and 11 seconds, the amphitheater was silent. Historians will later argue about every second of it. What is certain is that the choir, whose columns of light had never once in 11,000 years failed to respond within moments to any ritual invocation, said nothing at all, because the clause Voss had invoked had never been spoken aloud in the whole span of Concordat law, and the choir themselves, ancient as they were, had never been forced to determine, in real time before a filled amphitheater, exactly what the cost of the old law actually was. When the silence finally broke, it broke not with words, but with a single sustained tone from the choir's central column. The same tone, Thren scholars would later confirm after weeks of study, that opened every one of the Concordat's founding ceremonies, unused in this context for as long as anyone could trace. The cost, the tone resolved at last into words carried through a translation matrix that strained audibly to render it, has never been named because it has never been paid. Every species before you accepted the terms as given. You are the first to ask what the terms actually are before accepting them. Then name them, Voss said, please. The cost, the choir said, is this. A species that stands as a sovereign equal within the Concordat rather than a ward beneath it forfeits every protection stewardship provides, including the protection extended without exception to every ward for 11,000 years from being asked ever again to prove itself. You will not be sheltered from consequence the way a ward is sheltered. You will not be excused the way a ward is excused for the mistakes a young species makes. You will stand exactly as old as you are, among species vastly older, with none of the patience extended to a child and all of the scrutiny extended to a peer. That is the cost. It has always been the cost. No species has ever been willing to pay it because every species has always preferred, when finally offered the choice, to be forgiven rather than to be equal. The amphitheater held its breath again, 40 species worth, and this time it was humanity's silence that stretched, because Voss did not answer immediately. She turned instead and looked up at the gallery at Concordat, who had asked the first uncomfortable question of this entire threshold weeks before anyone understood its weight, at Adami still on his feet by refusal, at Rao who had fallen and been caught, at the 40 strangers who had built a hierarchy out of better arguments because nobody had told them any other way was possible. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. She had already asked them in the quiet hours before this morning whether they understood what she intended to do, and every one of them had said the same thing in their own words. We didn't come this far to be forgiven. We came this far to be trusted. We accept the cost, Voss said, turning back to the choir. Not because we don't understand what it means to lose the shelter of a ward, because we understand exactly what it means, and we've decided a species that's never been trusted with real consequence hasn't actually been trusted with anything at all. You asked us at the very beginning to prove ourselves worthy of your care. We're telling you now respectfully, and with real gratitude for the chance you gave us to reach this point, that we'd rather be worthy of your respect. What happened next is the part the choir still refused to translate into any language but their own. The sustained tone that had carried the cost's naming rose over the following seconds into something the amphitheater's 40 watching species experienced not as sound but as a kind of pressure, a recognition moving through the stone itself, and every species present who had passed through this same amphitheater across 11,000 years of history. Every delegate, every observer, every scholar who had come simply to watch, felt in that moment. The specific and total silence of an institution realizing, in real time, that it had built its oldest and most sacred law around an assumption nobody had ever tested, because nobody had ever needed to ask what would happen if a species said no to being forgiven. The choir's answer, when the translation matrix finally rendered it, was 6 words long, and every scholar who has studied the recording since agrees it is the shortest formal ruling in the whole of Concordat legal history. The petition is granted, stand as equals. There was no ceremony after that. No banquet, no formal welcome, none of the trappings that had marked the integration of every ward species. Before them, humanity simply walked out of the amphitheater the way it had walked in Voss at the center, Concordat and Havorson a step behind, Adami walking unaided, Rao beside him, 40 strangers from a relay station trailing after them all, none of them entirely sure in the moment what they had actually just changed. Sella Ithorn watched them go from the high tier, and beside her, Ossuary's crystalline chassis was silent for a long time before it finally spoke. 900 years, Sella said, before Ossuary could. 900 years, and I never once thought to ask what the cost of the old clause actually was. I don't think it occurred to me the clause could be invoked or that I was allowed to want it invoked. I think I mistook not questioning for wisdom. You are not the only one who mistook it, Ossuary said. I suspect, by morning, very few species in this amphitheater will still be able to make that mistake. They were right. Within a season, 3 more species, none of them new to the Concordat, all of them wards of centuries or millennia's standing, invoked the same clause the humans had found first. No longer buried and untranslated, but read aloud, in full, in every language the Concordat possessed. Because Idrin Kess's footnote had been copied and circulated within days of the reckoning by scholars who no longer needed anyone's permission to look for it. Not every species chose to pay the cost that was named. Sovereignty asked more than shelter did, and shelter, it turned out, was a comfortable thing to give up in principle and much harder to give up in practice. But every species that came after would, at least, know the price before they were asked to accept it, and know that the choice had, however quietly, always been theirs to make. There is a phrase the wardens still refuse to translate, sung once, for 11 seconds, in an amphitheater that no longer performs reckonings the way it once did, because no species since has arrived at that dais assuming the terms it is given are the only terms available. The historians who study this moment, generations after every person in that amphitheater has died, do not remember it as the day humanity won a trial no species had ever won before. Wars have been won. Trials, in the narrow sense the Concordat once meant by the word, are won and lost by species every era, and the wins are rarely worth more than a season's celebration. They remember it instead as the day an entire galaxy's oldest institution discovered that the questions it had been asking for 11,000 years were not the only questions that could be asked, and that the difference between a species proving itself worthy of care and a species standing as an equal in the room where care is decided had never been a test of strength at all. It had only ever been a question of who was willing to ask what the terms actually were, before agreeing to pay them. No one alive that night could have told you it would still matter this long afterward, but it does. It always does once someone finally asks.